Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You can't help when you take a walk through this country feeling like everything's broken. Inflation is at a 40-year high. 1.5 million Canadians visited a food bank in a single month. In the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, that number was 180,000 in one general metropolitan area. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals because they can't afford their groceries, and about half of Canadians are $200 or less away from insolvency. The number of insolvencies is up by a fifth compared to a year ago, the biggest increase in 13 years. 1 in 6 businesses are considering closing their doors. Households now face the prospect of 15% of their income going to debt servicing alone, a recent record. Mortgage interest costs for the average family are up 11% year over year, the biggest increase since 1991. And if you do renew your mortgage today, after having secured it 5 years ago, you're paying about $7,000 more per year for the very same house that you lived in last year. And if you think home ownership is expensive, well, be careful about renting. That now costs $2,000 a month in the average Canadian city. Vancouver is the world's 3rd most inflated housing market, Toronto the 10th. In fact, Vancouver is more expensive than New York, Singapore, London, England, and countless other of the world's most famous cities where they have more people, more money, and less land. And if you took a walk out of your house onto the street, you would find yourself more in danger of being attacked. 32% more, in fact. That is the increase in the violent crime rate since this Prime Minister took office. In fact, there were 124,000 more crimes committed this year than in 2015 when the Prime Minister came to office. There were 788 homicides in Canada last year. That's up from 611 back in 2015, another 29% increase. 92% increase in gang-related homicides, 61% increases in the reports of sexual assaults since 2015. Police-reported hate crimes are up 72% over the last 2 years alone. This, after the government tells us it is investing so much of its rhetoric and its money in fighting racism. We see hatred and hate-based violence increase by 3/4. 31,000 Canadians lost their lives to overdoses. If you take a walk down streets like East Hastings in Vancouver, you will see tent cities where adults are laying face first on the pavement, having just completed their most recent dose, not sure whether they'll actually awaken, where police and social workers literally have to scour the streets 24/7 to check pulses of people lying on the pavement, not as extraordinary circumstances or one-time emergencies, but daily events. In fact, there were 71,069 Canadians who died of overdoses in 2021. 21 people are dying every single day of overdoses. That is up from 11 per day. More than 6 million Canadians do not have access to a family doctor. And now, the most simple expectations that we have for our health, like going into a pharmacy and getting painkillers for our children, has now become out of reach. Canadians are now forced to drive south of the border to get the same medications that are not available on this side of the border. In fact, according to an association of pharmaceutical wholesalers that represents businesses in 19 countries, only Canada is suffering from these shortages. You know, meanwhile, speaking of the rest of the world, there are still people who want to come here, and we hope they do. but 2.6 million of them are waiting in immigration queues. Over 1 million have been waiting longer than the acceptable wait time. And when they arrive, they would arrive in one of the worst ranked airports on planet Earth at Pearson. Montreal is not far behind when it comes to records for delays. The Port of Vancouver is now ranked 376th out of 380 ports around the world. And speaking of getting people into the country, 10,000 Canadians were sent wrongly into quarantine by a $54 million app that we didn't need, that didn't work, and it could have been procured for $250,000. And speaking of building stuff, whether it's apps or anything else, our country is now ranked the second slowest for the time it takes to get a building permit. The average building permit takes over 250 days in Canada, but only 28 days in South Korea. No wonder we can't build the factories, the pipelines, and most important of all, the houses that give people homes. We import 130,000 barrels of overseas oil every day, even though we have the third biggest supply on planet Earth. All of these things are broken. And what's most interesting about them is that they all happen under the Prime Minister's watch while he refuses to take responsibility for any of them. I mean, any one of these things in isolation would be considered a catastrophic embarrassment. But together, they show the story of a country that can't get anything done, that has accepted dramatic reductions in its quality of life and its expectation for what a person can receive living in this country of ours. The Prime Minister, who is in charge of the central government, ought to take some responsibility, but he takes none. 40-year highs in inflation. Oh, he says it has something to do with the war between Russia and Ukraine, even though inflation was already 2.5 times the target before the war even began, and less than 0.3% of our trade is with Russia and Ukraine combined, and the stuff that they produce is stuff we already have here. He's not responsible for the massive increases in costs. He's not responsible, he says, for the doubling of house prices or the fact that rental costs are out of reach. He's not responsible for the skyrocketing crime rates in our streets, even though his government oversees the criminal code and the national police force and the border security. He's not responsible for the overdose deaths of so many Canadians. He's not responsible for the fact that so many are going to food banks. He's not responsible for the fact that our children can't get medication. He says he's not responsible, Madam Speaker, and he's right. He is not responsible. He is not responsible, even though he has the power to affect all of these things, and in many cases, he is the one who caused them in the first place. I've never seen a Prime Minister who is so desperate to have more power with less responsibility. He wants to take over what we see and say on the internet. He wants to control a greater share of the money that Canadians earn by constantly increasing spending faster than the economy grows. He wants to have more power over dental and pharmaceutical and childcare rather than allowing Canadians to control those things for themselves. He wants to have more control over health care, dictating terms to our provinces on how they should run their hospitals, even while he doesn't want to be responsible for any of the health outcomes that we see in our emergency rooms across the country. He wants more power, but he does not want more responsibility. And when we ask him about these failures, his constant refrain is that he's spending more money. And on that count, he's right. There is no question that this government is the all-time heavyweight champion of spending. Right? They have increased spending by 30% over pre-COVID levels, even though COVID programs have now ended. But the results, as I've just listed, speak for themselves. Madam Speaker, It is not a consolation prize that we are spending more to achieve these failures. The only thing worse than failing is failing expensively, and that's what this Prime Minister is doing. Only in government, by the way, would politicians think it is acceptable to measure their success by how expensive they could be. Right? Like, for example, this week, the Auditor General came out and said they've spent an extra $1 billion plus specifically on homelessness. Well, that sounds good, but they can't keep track of how many homeless people there are in Canada. They have no idea what the results are. They have a overall housing program of $40 billion, which is supposed to make housing more affordable, all the while house prices have doubled. The more they spend, the more things cost, and the worse the results. In real world, people judge by the outcome. You know, for example, if I go to the grocery store and I come back home and I pull out a receipt and I say to my wife, you know, I spent $700 on groceries. And I'm holding 2 bags of groceries. She's going to say, well, where did all the money go? I say, well, you have to give me a high five because they were really expensive. Whatever it is I have in these bags must be terrific because it costs more than when you go grocery shopping. Well, the reality is that nobody in the real world judges their success that way. You don't have restaurants that say, come dine with us, it's $500 a night to be in our dining room. We won't tell you anything about the service, the ambiance, or what ends up on your plate. What's most important is that our meals are the most expensive, therefore they must be the best. Only in politics do politicians think do people think it is appropriate to judge success by how expensive government can be? What if instead of judging our success by how much we spend, we judged it by how much we delivered, the results that we actually achieved? Everything feels broken in the lives of everyday Canadians, but the good news is that we can fix it. We live in the greatest country in the world. Our country has overcome these difficulties before and has rebuilt and given new hope where before there was hurt. And there is a very clear path to achieving that result, and that is, let's start with the issue of money. Instead of spending more, let's achieve more. How do you do that? Why don't we cap government spending and cut waste? Bring in a dollar-for-dollar law that requires the government find $1 of savings for every new dollar of spending measures. That would force politicians to make the same either-or trade-offs when they spend our money as everyday Canadians make in their lives. When a local mechanic decides he's going to spend a little more on advertising, well, he has to spend a little bit more somewhere else in order to free up that money. When a family decides they're going to build a new porch, they might decide not to go on that vacation, or they might try to find a bargain on both. They might get a deal on a vacation and go to the local construction yard and get some discarded lumber in order to build that porch more affordably. Politicians and bureaucrats don't make those kinds of calculations because they don't have to. There is always more in the pot. They can tax more, borrow more, or print more. Now, that scarcity gets passed on to the taxpayer. Every creature in the universe has to live with scarcity. The great economist Thomas Sowell once said, the first law of economics is scarcity. There's always more demand than there is supply. The first law of politics, however, is to ignore the first law of economics, right? And that is what politicians do by simply putting that scarcity onto other people by driving up their costs and externalizing the consequences of spending decisions. If instead we force by law politicians to live with the same laws of scarcity as every other business, consumer, or taxpayer, then we would force better results. Politicians would need to go into their departments and ask themselves, if I want to increase spending on this initiative, where can I find the savings somewhere else? They would be incentivized to go line by line, year after year, to find low priority items in order to redirect the money to high priority results for Canadians. Let us get our Bank of Canada back to its core mandate of 2% inflation, rather than printing money to pay for political spending. Let us also get rid of the obvious examples of wasteful spending. We could cancel the ArriveCan app, get rid of the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bank that has achieved no projects but has guaranteed the profits of large multinationals and the bonuses of executives. Getting rid of this waste would allow us to save the money and free up more resources for things that achieve results for our people. And instead of creating more cash, why don't we create more of what cash buys in this country? Why don't we grow more food, build more houses, and generate more Canadian energy? Speaking of energy, I had the privilege of visiting the single largest infrastructure project in Canadian history, LNG Canada, a $40 billion private sector investment approved by the previous Conservative government, and that could only come to pass because the government of British Columbia agreed to exempt the project from the carbon tax. Otherwise, it would not have been economical. What result was actually achieved by this project, or will be achieved? The answer is that it will cut 60 million tons of carbon out of the atmosphere by replacing overseas coal-fired plants with clean Canadian natural gas. Now, isn't it interesting that this project had to be exempt from both C-69, the government's environmental law, and the carbon tax in order to go ahead and reduce emissions? In other words, in order for this environmentally friendly project to occur, this government's environmental policies had to be ignored. That proves how backwards they are. If the carbon tax, if the carbon tax had been in place, then the project would not have been economical. If Bill C-69, the anti-energy law, had been in place, there's no way it would have been approved. And what would have happened? 60 million more tons of greenhouse gases would have gone into the global atmosphere because there would have not been the availability of clean Canadian natural gas to replace that dirty coal in Asia. We have an enormous advantage reaching Asia. BC is the shortest North American shipping distance to Asia. We also have the shortest North American shipping distance to Europe from the east coast of Canada. And you know, speaking of the east coast, the Prime Minister visited there, and he was asked about approving natural gas projects in Canada's east coast and said, well, there might not be a business case. He was standing next to the German Chancellor when he said that. Ironically, the Germans just announced that they completed a new natural gas import terminal in 194 days. You know what they will not be importing there? Canadian natural gas. Why? Because we don't export any natural gas overseas. We don't have any terminals completed, despite 15 of them having been proposed when this Prime Minister took office. Not one of them has been completed. Only one is under construction, the aforementioned LNG Canada. The rest are in limbo. We could be sending the Germans our natural gas to break European dependence on Putin and to transform dollars for dictators into paychecks for our people in this country. Why don't we do that? And think of the human benefit that that would bring. When I was in northern British Columbia, I spoke to a Haisla First Nations grandmother who broke down into tears when she said that her daughter had been diagnosed, her granddaughter had been diagnosed with autism, but that after decades of federal promises that these kinds of conditions would be met with services and treatment, there is no treatment in her region, a rural, remote, northern British Columbia community. She said that if natural gas projects like LNG Canada were allowed to go ahead, and if her nation could sign agreements to share in the benefits of those programs, then there would be local resources under the control of First Nations communities to provide children like her granddaughter with autism treatment and countless other things. Why don't we empower First Nations to do more things like that by allowing these projects to go ahead? We need to get the government out of the way so these opportunities can occur. We need, for example, to incentivize more home building by requiring our large municipalities with overpriced markets to approve fast and affordable building permits so that we can build the millions of new homes that will be required for our existing population and for those who are yet to come to our country. We need to require that every federally funded transit station be pre-approved for high-density housing around it so that our young people don't even need to own a car to live in an affordable house. We need to sell off 15% of the 37,000 underutilized federal buildings so that that can be made into affordable housing for our young people. We need to get government out of the way so that our projects can get completed and our people can have homes and they can have energy. And finally, we need to get government out of the way and off the backs of our farmers so that they can produce more nutritious food in this country. Isn't it an outrage that with the 6th biggest supply of farmland per capita on Earth, Canada has 1 in 5 households where people are actually skipping meals because of the excessive cost of food. We should not only be able to feed our own families, but be the breadbasket of the world by canceling the carbon tax, not just on primary farming, but also on drying food and transporting it. We need to cancel the carbon tax on our truckers so that they can bring that food affordably to our supermarkets. And we need to remove the ridiculous fertilizer tariffs and taxes that the government is bringing in so that we can produce more food on every acre of land in order to have greater output and to reduce the amount of fuel that has to be burned in order to produce that prodigious output. Let's unleash the fierce power of our farmers to feed us again, and let's make it possible for our people to walk safely in the streets once again, something we used to take for granted. The answer is clear. The vast majority of crime is committed by a tiny minority of criminals. A recent letter from the BC Union of Mayors demonstrated the number of instances of crime and criminality that are generated by a tiny minority. For example, in Vancouver, 40 individuals were responsible for 6,000 negative interactions with the police, most of them arrests. You think about that. The same 40 people arrested 6,000 times in a year. That's like 150 arrests per person per year. We all agree that if a young person makes a mistake, that we should invest in rehabilitating them, get them back on the street once they're ready into a job as productive members of society. But when someone commits 60, 70, 80, 100 violent offenses, and we consistently and automatically release them early on bail and even after they are convicted, that is contributing to the criminality that has grown by 1/3 since this Prime Minister took office. So let us target that small minority of criminals with serious consequences to get them off the streets and keep the streets safe. You know, it is not out of hatred for the criminal that we take these actions. It is out of love for the victims, the people who desperately want to live safely in our neighborhoods. We need to instead of investing money in going after the lawful, licensed, trained, and tested hunters and sport shooters, we should put that money into bolstering our borders to keep the smuggled drugs and guns that are terrorizing our communities out of our country altogether. And finally, we need to come to the rescue of those people living in these all too common tent cities. Whether it's Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal, or whether it's smaller centers like Peterborough, where this phenomenon is growing out of control. We see people that could be your brother, your sister, God forbid, your son or your daughter, who've lost their homes, are living on the streets, and are playing Russian roulette with their life. Every single time they ingest these poisons, they risk stopping their hearts. And we can change it. We know that the government's current approach, which is to liberalize access to the most dangerous opioids, and in fact, taxpayer funding for so-called safe supply to make them even more abundant using the public resources. Madam Speaker, there is no such thing as safe poison. It is all deadly. But we know what we can do to save these people's lives, because they're doing it in Alberta today. They have redirected the resources away from so-called safe taxpayer-funded supply of drugs over to recovery and treatment, getting the addict off the street into a recovery center where they're first given detox that cleans the poison out of their system. Then they are given 60 to 90 days of treatment, inpatient care, building up the habits of a clean, drug-free life, and then gently reintroduced to society in jobs and opportunities, during which time they have counseling that keeps them on the right track. And you know the result of that approach? They have cut overdoses in half. They are saving lives, proving there is always hope. It is possible to save these people. Everything does feel broken in this country, but it is our role in this House to turn all of that hurt into hope. It is our job to come forward with the practical, common-sense solutions that have made this the best country on earth. It is our job to take responsibility for the suffering that exists in this country today and to replace it with opportunity, to give people back control of their lives here in Canada, in the freest country on earth, where people can chart their own destinies and be masters of their own fate. Thank you very much.